Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of the Memoirs of General Rapp. Chapter 7.
We had not been able to shut up all the Austrian force in Ulm. Werneck escaped by the way of Heidenheim, and the Archduke hastened after him. They were both in full flight, but fate had pronounced her decree, and against that there is no appeal. Napoleon, being informed, in the middle of the night, that they were advancing on Albeck, immediately summoned the Grand Duke. "A division," said he, "has escaped from the garrison and threatens our rear. Pursue and destroy it. Let not one escape." The rain descended in torrents, and the roads were in a dreadful condition, but fatigue and danger were forgotten in the triumph of victory. Our troops hastened onward, intent on conquest. Murat came up with the enemy, attacked and routed him. He pursued him closely in his flight for the space of 2 leagues, scarcely allowing him time to take breath. Some masses occupied Erbrechtingen with cannon. Night had set in and our horses were exhausted. We halted. The 9th light arrived about 10 o'clock. We then advanced. The attack was resumed. Village, artillery, caissons, all were taken. General O'Donnell endeavored to keep his ground with his rear guard, but he was observed by one of our quartermasters, who wounded him and made him prisoner. It was midnight. Our troops were overcome with fatigue, and we pursued our triumph no farther. The enemy fled precipitately in the direction of Nordlingen, where we possessed artillery and depots. It was important to prevent his reaching that point. Murat detached some parties who, by harassing and impeding him in his march, forced him to take up a position, that is to say, to lose time. On the other hand, General Ravoux was to put the bridge of Donauwörth in a state of security and to proceed with the surplus of his force to the Wiesnitz. Every passage was intercepted. These arrangements being made, the prince began his march and came up with the Archduke, who was deploying on Neresheim. We attacked him with the enthusiasm inspired by victory. The shock was irresistible. The cavalry fled, and the infantry laid down their arms. Guns, standards, troops, all were taken in a mass. The most terrible disorder prevailed. Klein, Falconet, and Lanuses continued the pursuit, intercepted the enemy on every side, and dispersed him in every direction. Werneck was summoned to surrender. He hesitated, but a combination of extraordinary circumstances at length induced him to do so. The officer appointed to escort the French flag of truce crossed several plains in quest of his chief. He met the Prince of Hohenzollern, to whom he communicated the object of his mission. The prince accompanied him, not doubting that the field marshal would accept the conditions. They directed their course to Nordlingen, which they found occupied, not by the Austrians, but by French troops. On the other hand, General Lasalle had advanced on Merking and had taken 1,000 men. The fugitives spread alarm in the enemy's headquarters. These accounts staggered Werneck, and he showed himself disposed to treat. He detained the French officer and sent as a hostage the major of the regiment of Ranitz. He deferred the negotiation until next day, for he wished to try the chances of the night. As soon as it was dark, he proposed to combine his forces with those of the Archduke, but the French intercepted the road, and General Ravoux drove back Liechtenstein and penetrated the Great Park, which our hussars attacked in the rear. Werneck dared not go farther. He thought himself surrounded, and he negotiated. Our troops occupied the heights in order to be prepared against a surprise, but night advanced, and Hohenzollern, who on the preceding day had regarded the capitulation as inevitable, now availed himself of darkness to elude it. General Miscary followed his example. They escaped with the cavalry and a few infantry troops, which had formed a part of the corps that had laid down arms. It might have been supposed that they were bound by the engagements of their chief, but no such thing. At least they thought so, for they rejoined the wrecks of the Archduke's force, with which they threw themselves on the Prussian territory. We came up with them at Gunderhausen and demanded the fulfillment of the convention. The Prince of Schwarzenberg referred to orders, wished to clear up doubts, to write, to explain, in a word, to gain time. The Prussians insisted on their neutrality. They required that the city should not be attacked, and that the enemy's column should evacuate it. A person in magisterial robes came, escorted by a party of the Archduke's officers, to threaten us with the displeasure of King William. Klein was not the man to be intimidated by this kind of masquerade. He sent to the Grand Duke, the magistrate in the Austrian interest, and gave the signal for the attack. The Prince of Schwarzenberg was quite disconcerted. He had not imagined that the general was so near at hand. He protested against the violation of the Prussian territory and proposed that we should respect it and not occupy Gunderhausen. Klein told him to set a good example, and he would follow it. We continued to advance, and yet Schwarzenberg came to no decision. Murat, tired of being taken for a dupe, gave orders for terminating the discussions and marching forward. The enemy's rear guard then set off at full gallop and left us in possession of the place. We pursued him for several leagues without being able to come up with him. It was night, and we took a position. We resumed our march at daybreak, but the Archduke had fled so rapidly that we did not overtake the rear of his baggage until we reached Nuremberg. A piquet of our advance guard charged him and obliged the escort battalion to lay down their arms. The piquet then pressed forward and entered a woody road, thronged with artillery and baggage, pursuing some hundreds of dragoons who vainly endeavored to rally themselves. The great body of the Austrian force was awaiting us in an advantageous position. Our chasseurs were obliged to fall back, but the hussars and carabineers advanced, and the army was completely routed. The Archduke himself narrowly escaped being made prisoner. This was a finishing stroke to the corps who had escaped from Ulm. In the short space of 5 days, 7,000 brave men marched over 45 leagues, destroyed an army of 25,000 men, took their military chest and baggage, carried off 128 pieces of cannon, 11 standards, and made from 12 to 15,000 prisoners. Of all the Archduke's force, nothing now remained but a few thousand unfortunate men scattered about in the woods. Klein, however, persisted in his demands, and Werneck himself urged the fulfillment of the conditions that had been entered into. They required that the officers included in the capitulations should surrender themselves prisoners. The French general addressed his remonstrances to the Archduke, or, in his absence, to the general commanding the Austrian army. But such disorder prevailed that the flag of truce was obliged to advance into the very heart of Bohemia before he could find an officer to receive his dispatches. The answer was long expected, but it at length arrived. It was a letter from General Collerard, who transmitted to us the following correspondence. To Count Hohenzollern, Lieutenant General in the service of His Imperial and Royal Majesty. You have submitted Lieutenant General Werneck's letter to my consideration. I must inform you that, according to the rules of war and the law of nations, I regard the pretensions of the French general as very illegal. Consequently, I declare that you and the troops with whom you have returned cannot be included in the capitulation. I therefore order you, as well as them, to continue to serve as before. Signed, Ferdinand. Countersigned, Morval. Major and Aide-de-Camp. Egra, October 23, 1805. By this document, the capitulation was rendered no capitulation, and thus Hohenzollern had fled without any violation of honor. He seemed astonished at being required to surrender in a mass troops which he was losing no less effectually in detail. His letter was curious. It was as follows. To Field Marshal Baron Werneck. Dear comrade, I cannot conceal my astonishment at the proposition that has been made to me to surrender with the cavalry which formed part of your corps. When I left you, you in my presence refused to enter into any capitulation, and, for my part, I intended to bring back the cavalry to the army at all hazards, if you could not extricate yourself with the infantry. I endeavored to do this, and I succeeded. I do not understand by what law I can be accounted a prisoner of war, not having been present at your arrangements, in which I should never have suffered myself to be included. Having been separated from you since yesterday, I no longer conceive myself bound to fulfill your orders. I receive the commands of His Royal Highness, our General-in-Chief. I have the honor to be your very humble and obedient servant. Signed, Lieutenant General Hohenzollern, Privy Councillor. Napoleon was satisfied with himself, with the army, and with every body. He expressed his approbation of our conduct by the following proclamation. Soldiers of the great army, in the space of 15 days we have finished the campaign. All that we proposed to do has been accomplished. We have driven from Bavaria the troops of the House of Austria and restored our ally to the sovereignty of his states. That army which, with equal presumption and imprudence, came to station itself on our frontiers, has been annihilated. But what does it signify to England? Her object is fulfilled. We are no longer at Boulogne, and her subsidy will be neither more nor less. Of the 100,000 men who compose that army, 60,000 are prisoners. They will supply the place of our conscripts in agricultural labors. 200 pieces of cannon, the whole park, 90 standards, and all their generals are in our hands. Scarcely 15,000 men have escaped. Soldiers, I announce to you a great battle, but thanks to the ill-concerted plans of the enemy, I have obtained all the success I anticipated without encountering any risk, and it is a circumstance unparalleled in the history of nations that so great a triumph should have diminished our force only by 1,500 men rendered unfit for service. Soldiers, this success is due to the full confidence you reposed in your emperor, to your patience under fatigue and privation of every kind, and to your singular intrepidity. But we shall not stop here. You are eager to commence a second campaign. The Russian army, which English gold has transported from the further extremity of Europe, will experience a similar fate. The present campaign is particularly connected with the glory of the French infantry. The question, which has already been determined in Switzerland and Holland, will now be decided for the second time, namely, whether the French infantry be the first or the second in Europe. There are among the Russians no generals over whom I can hope to obtain glory. All my care will be to gain the victory with the least possible effusion of blood. My soldiers are my children.
Chapter 8.
We had now done with the Austrians, and we advanced to meet the Russians. Kutuzov affected resolution, and we thought him disposed to fight. We congratulated ourselves on this new opportunity of augmenting our glory. But all this was mere pretense on the part of Kutuzov. He abandoned the inn, the Traun, and the Ems, and disappeared. We pressed forward on Vienna. We advanced with inconceivable speed. Never was a movement executed with such rapidity. The emperor became apprehensive. He feared lest by this precipitancy our rear might be endangered, and our flank exposed to the Russians. "Murat," said he to me, "runs on like a blind man. He presses forward as though the only object were to enter Vienna. The enemy has nobody to oppose him. He may dispose of all his forces and destroy Mortier. Direct Berthier to stop the columns." Berthier came. Marshal Soult received orders to fall back as far as Modern. Davoust took up his position at the junction of the roads of Lilienfeld and Neustadt, and Bernadotte stationed himself at Melk. But these arrangements did not prevent the engagement of which Napoleon feared the issue. 4,000 French were attacked by the whole of the enemy's force, but skill, courage, and the necessity of conquering made amends for our inferiority of numbers. The Russians were driven back. The intelligence of this astonishing victory set our whole force in motion. The emperor pursued his march with even more eagerness than he had before evinced in suspending it. He wished to come up with the Austrians, to take the passage of the Danube, to turn and cut off their allies, and beat them before they could receive reinforcements. He hastily dispatched orders. Men and horses, all were immediately in motion. "The field is open," said Napoleon. "Murat may yield to his natural impetuosity, but he must take a wider range. He must surprise the bridge." He immediately wrote to him as follows: "The grand object at the present moment is to pass the Danube in order to drive the Russians from Krems by attacking their rear. The enemy will probably destroy the bridge of Vienna, and yet, if there should be any possibility of gaining it undamaged, that must be done. This consideration alone can induce the emperor to enter Vienna, and in that case you must introduce into the city only a portion of your cavalry and the grenadiers. It is necessary that you should ascertain the force of the civic guard in Vienna. The emperor presumes that you have planted some pieces of cannon to intercept the passage across the Danube between Krems and Vienna. Some parties of cavalry should be stationed on the right bank of the river. But you mention nothing of this to the emperor. His Majesty thinks it necessary to know what he has to trust to, so that if it should be possible to intercept the Danube below Vienna, It may be done. General Suchet's division will remain with a portion of your cavalry on the great road leading from Vienna to Bukersdorf, at least if you be not master of the bridge across the Danube, and if it has not been burned. In that case, Suchet's division must repair thither in order to be enabled to cross the river with your cavalry and grenadiers, and to march on as rapidly as possible to fall on the communications of the Russians. I think it probable that the Emperor will remain all the day at St. Polten. His Majesty recommends you, Prince, to transmit to him frequent accounts of your proceedings. When you arrive at Vienna, provide yourself with the best maps that can be procured of the environs of that city and of Lower Austria. Should General Count Hohenzollern or any other individual wish to have an interview with the Emperor, send him hither with all speed. The civic guard on duty at Vienna must amount to upwards of 500 men. When once you reach Vienna, you may easily obtain intelligence of the arrival of the other Russian columns, as well as of the design of those who have established themselves at Krems. You will have your own cavalry, together with the corps of Marshals Lannes and Devast, in the operation of turning the Russians and falling on their rear. As to the corps of Marshals Bernadotte and Soult, they cannot be disposed of until we shall definitively know what course the Russians may adopt. After 10 o'clock in the morning, you may enter Vienna. Endeavor to surprise the bridge of the Danube, or, if it should be destroyed, adopt the most speedy means of crossing the river. That is the grand affair at present. But if, before 10 o'clock, Monsieur de Joulet should present himself with proposals for negotiating and inducing you to suspend your march, you may stop your movement on Vienna, but you must nevertheless direct your attention to the best means of crossing the Danube at Klosterberg, or some other favorable point. The Emperor directs that between Segartskirchen and Vienna you shall station, at the distance of 2 French leagues from each other, posts of cavalry consisting of 10 men each, whose horses will serve as relays to the officers whom you may send with accounts of your movements. The men forming these posts may bear despatches from Segartskirchen to St. Polten. Marshal Bessières will station posts of the Emperor's Guard.
Chapter 9.
We were at St. Polten. Napoleon was riding on horseback on the Vienna road when he perceived an open carriage advancing, in which were seated a priest and a lady bathed in tears. The Emperor was dressed as usual in the uniform of a colonel of the chasseurs of the guard. The lady did not know him. He inquired the cause of her affliction, and whither she was going. "Sir," she replied, "I have been robbed at about 2 leagues from hence by a party of soldiers who have killed my gardener. I am going to request that your Emperor will grant me a guard. He once knew my family well, and lay under obligations to them." "Your name?" inquired Napoleon. "De Brunny," answered the lady. "I am the daughter of Monsieur de Marbeuf, formerly governor of Corsica." "I am delighted to meet with you, madame," exclaimed Napoleon with the most charming frankness, "and to have an opportunity of serving you. I am the Emperor." The lady was amazed. Napoleon consoled her and directed her to wait for him at headquarters. He treated her with the utmost attention, granted her a piquet of chasseurs of his guard, and sent her away happy and contented. Napoleon had received a report which he was reading with an air of satisfaction. I entered his closet. "Well, Rapp," said he, "do you know that we have parties of our troops in the very heart of Bohemia?" "Yes, sire." "Do you know what sort of cavalry has beat the Uhlans, captured posts, and taken magazines?" "No, sire." "Our infantry mounted on draught horses." "How?" He handed me the report. Some of our detachments who had penetrated into Bohemia suddenly found themselves in an open tract of country. They had but 20 dragoons, they would not fall back, and they dared not advance further. In this perplexing situation, the commander thought of an expedient. He collected together all the baggage horses, mounted his infantry, and thus equipped, led them through the thick forests in the neighborhood of Egra. Some parties of the enemy's cavalry who advanced to oppose them were driven back. We took men, horses, and provisions. The latter were committed to the flames. I returned the report to the Emperor. "Well," said he, "what think you of this new kind of cavalry?" "Admirable, sire." "Men who have French blood in their veins," observed he, always know how to deal death among the enemy's ranks. We marched close upon the enemy's rear guard. We might easily have taken it, but we avoided doing so. We wished to lull his vigilance. We did not press him closely, and we circulated reports of peace. We suffered both troops and baggage to escape us, but the loss of a few men was of little consequence. The preservation of the bridges was the important point. If they should be broken, it was determined that we should repair them. We took our measures accordingly. The troops, who were posted in echelon on the road, were warned to allow no demonstration to escape them that was likely to put the enemy on his guard. No one was permitted to enter Vienna. But everything being examined and every arrangement completed, the Grand Duke took possession of the capital and directed Lannousses and Bertrand to make without delay a reconnaissance on the river. They found at the gates of the suburb a post of Austrian cavalry. There had been no fighting for upwards of 3 days. It appeared as though an armistice had been entered into. Lannousses and Bertrand accosted the Austrian commandant, commenced a conversation with him, followed him closely, and would not suffer him to quit them. On reaching the banks of the river, they still persisted in following him, in spite of his wish to get rid of them. The Austrian became impatient. The French generals asked leave to communicate with the general commanding the troops stationed on the left bank of the river. They obtained permission to do so, but the 10th Hussars were not allowed to accompany them, and they were consequently obliged to halt and take a position. Meanwhile, our troops were advancing, led by the Grand Duke and Marshal Lannes. The bridge still remained undamaged, but the trains were laid, and the gunners held their matches in readiness. The least sign that might have indicated the intention of passing by force would have ruined the enterprise. It was necessary to resort to artifice, and we succeeded in imposing on the simplicity of the Austrians. The two marshals dismounted, and only a small detachment entered upon the bridge. General Belliard advanced, walking with his hands behind his back, accompanied by 2 officers of the staff. Lannes joined him with some others. They walked about, talking together, and at length joined the Austrians. The officer commanding the post at first directed them to stand back, but he at length permitted them to advance, and they entered into conversation together. They repeated what had already been affirmed by General Bertrand, namely, that the negotiations were advancing, that the war was at an end, and that there would be no more fighting and slaughter. "Why," said the marshal, "do you keep your guns still pointed at us? Has there not been enough of bloodshed? Do you wish to attack us and to prolong miseries which weigh more heavily on you than on us? Come, let us have no more provocation. Turn your guns." Half persuaded and half convinced, the commanding officer yielded. The artillery was turned in the direction of the Austrians, and the troops laid down their arms in bundles. During this conference, the platoon of our advance guard came up slowly, and at length it arrived, masking sappers and gunners, who threw the combustible matters into the river, sprinkled water on the powder, and cut the trains. The Austrian commander, who was not sufficiently acquainted with the French language to take much interest in the conversation, perceived that the troop was gaining ground, and endeavored to make us understand that he could not permit it. Marshal Lannes and General Belliard tried to satisfy him. They observed that the cold was severe, and that our men were only marching about to warm themselves. But the column still continued to advance, and it was already 3/4 over the bridge. The commander lost all patience and ordered his troops to fire. They instantly took up their arms, and the artillerymen prepared their guns. Our situation was terrible. A little less presence of mind on our part, and the bridge would have been blown up, our troops in the river, and the campaign at an end. But the Austrian had to deal with men who were not easily disconcerted. Marshal Lannes seized him by the one arm and General Belliard by the other. They threatened him and drowned his voice when he attempted to call for help. Meanwhile, the Prince of Augsburg arrived, accompanied by General Bertrand. An officer set off to render an account of the state of affairs to the Grand Duke, and on his way transmitted to the troop an order to quicken their march and arrive speedily. The marshal advanced to meet the prince, complained of the conduct of the commander of the post, requested that he might be punished and removed from the rear guard. where he might impede the negotiations. Augsburg fell into the snare. He deliberated, approved, contradicted, and lost himself in a useless conversation. Our troops made the most of their time. They arrived, debouched, and the bridge was taken. Reconnaissances were immediately ordered in every direction, and General Belliard led our columns on the road leading to Stockrau, where they took a position. Augsburg, mortified at his ill-timed loquacity, proceeded to the Grand Duke, who, after a short conversation, referred him to Napoleon and also crossed the river. The Austrian piquet still kept guard on the bridge. We bivouacked in confusion. The troops were mingled together at Stockrau as on the banks of the river. Napoleon found that this interspersion was not convenient, and he sent the Uhlans to Vienna, where they were disarmed. We arrived at Austerlitz. The Russians had a force superior to ours. They had repulsed our advance guard, and they thought us already subdued. The attack commenced, but instead of that easy conquest which had been obtained merely by their guard, they everywhere experienced the most obstinate resistance. The battle had already lasted an hour, and it was still far from being decided in their favor. They resolved to make a last attempt on our center. The Imperial Guard deployed. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery advanced on the bridge without the movement being perceived by Napoleon, for the nature of the ground screened it from his observation. A discharge of musketry was soon heard. A brigade, commanded by General Schinner, had been penetrated by the Russians. Napoleon ordered me to take the Mamelukes, 2 squadrons of chasseurs and 1 of grenadiers of the guard, and to go forward to reconnoiter the state of things. I set off at full gallop, and it was not until I came within gunshot of the scene of action that I discovered the disaster. The enemy's cavalry was in the midst of our square and was sabering our troops. A little further back, we discerned masses of infantry and cavalry forming the reserve. The enemy relinquished the attack and turned to meet me. 4 pieces of artillery arrived and were placed in battery. I advanced in good order. I had the brave Colonel Morland on my left and General Dallemagne on my right. "Do you see," said I to my troop, "our friends and brothers trampled on by the enemy? Avenge them, avenge our colors." We rushed on the artillery, which was taken. The cavalry, who awaited us, was repulsed by the same shock. They fled in disorder, and we, as well as the enemy, trampled over the bodies of our troops, whose squares had been penetrated. The men who had escaped being wounded were rallied. A squadron of horse grenadiers arrived to reinforce me, and I was enabled to receive the reserves, who came up in aid of the Russian guard. We resumed the attack, which was maintained with terrible fury. The infantry dared not venture to fire. All was confusion. We fought man to man. Finally, the intrepidity of our troops triumphed over every obstacle. The Russians fled and dispersed. Alexander and the Emperor of Austria witnessed the defeat. Stationed on a height at a little distance from the field of battle, they saw the guard, which was expected to decide the victory, cut to pieces by a handful of brave men. Their guns and baggage had fallen into our hands, and Prince Repnin was our prisoner. Unfortunately, we had a great number of men killed and wounded. Colonel Morland was no more, and I had myself received a saber wound in the head. I went to render an account of this affair to the Emperor. My broken saber, my wound, the blood with which I was covered, the decided advantage we had gained with so small a force over the enemy's chosen troops, inspired Napoleon with the idea of the picture which was painted by Gerard. The Russians, as I have already mentioned, hoped to defeat us with their guard alone. This presumption offended Napoleon, and it was long before he forgot it. After the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon made me a general of division and sent me to the castle of Austerlitz until I should recover from my wound, which, however, was not dangerous. The Emperor visited me several times, once on the day on which he granted an interview to the Emperor of Austria. He put into my hands 2 letters which had been intercepted by our advanced posts. One was from Prince Charles, and the other from a Prince Liechtenstein. Their contents were rather important, and I got them translated. On his way back in the evening, Napoleon came and had these letters read to him. He talked to me a great deal about Francis II, his complaints and regrets, and told me many curious circumstances respecting him. We set out for Schönbrunn, and in about a fortnight after our arrival thither, Napoleon sent for me. "Are you able to travel?" said he. "Yes, sire." "Well then, go and give an account of the Battle of Austerlitz to Marmont in order to vex him for not having come, and observe the effect that it will produce on the Italians." He then gave me the following instructions. "Monsieur General Rapp, you will proceed to Gratz, where you will remain as long as may be necessary to communicate to General Marmont the details of the Battle of Austerlitz. Inform him that the negotiations are open, but that nothing is concluded, and that he must therefore hold himself in readiness for any event that may occur. You must also make yourself acquainted with General Marmont's situation and ascertain what number of the enemy's force is before him. Tell him that I desire he will send spies into Hungary, and that he will communicate to me all the information he may collect. You must next repair to Laybach, where you will find Marshal Massena, who has the command of the 8th Army Corps, and transmit to me a correct report of his situation. You will inform Massena that if the negotiations are broken off, as it is possible they may be, he will be sent to Vienna. Let me know what amount of the enemy's force Marshal Massena has before him, and report to me the situation of his corps in every point of view. You will next proceed to Palmanova, after strongly urging Marshal Massena to arm and provision the fortress in an effectual way, and you will inform me of the state in which it is. Next proceed and examine the posts which we occupy before Venice, and ascertain the state of our troops. Thence you will repair to the army of General St. Cyr, who is about to march on Naples. You must ascertain the nature and the amount of his force. You will return by the way of Klagenfurt, where you will see Marshal Ney, and then rejoin me. Do not fail to write to me from every place at which you stop. Dispatch estafettes to me from Gratz, Laybach, Palmanova, Venice, and the place where the army of Naples may be stationed. I pray God to take you into his holy keeping. Napoleon, Schönbrunn, 25th Brumaire, year 14. I rejoined Napoleon at Munich, whither he had gone to be present at the marriage of Prince Eugene. The prince came from Italy, and I accompanied him. During my absence, peace had been concluded at Vienna. The emperor had an interview with Prince Charles. He intended to have presented him with a magnificent sword, but he was displeased with the archduke, and the sword was not given. We set out for Paris. Acclamations resounded on every side. Napoleon was never received with so much enthusiasm.
Chapter 10.
During our stay at Ulm, the Prussians suddenly conceived the idea that they had an ancient inheritance of glory to defend. They were roused, and they took up arms. Haugwitz came to inform us of this sudden reminiscence. But the Battle of Austerlitz had taken place in the interim. When the minister arrived, nothing was thought of but alliance and devotion. Napoleon was not the dupe of these diplomatic protestations. He was aware of the intrigues and the chivalric scenes that had been resorted to for the purpose of exciting the multitude. Previous to the action, he had said, "If I am beaten, they will march upon my rear. If I am victorious, they will say that they wished to have taken part with me." They knew not how to make choice either of peace or war, and they watched the progress of events. This indirect policy was not without its effect. It cost them Ansbach, Baruth, a part of the Grand Duchy of Berg, and their possessions in Westphalia. They became enraged. I was sent to Hanover, which we had abandoned to them. The ostensible motive of my journey was the delivering up of the fortress of Hameln. Its real purpose was to learn the state of the public mind. I was directed to discover what was the general opinion with regard to the Prussians, whether war was spoken of, whether the army wished for it, and finally, to buy up at Hamburg all the pamphlets against Napoleon and France which I could procure. My mission was not difficult of execution. The Prussians were exasperated and insolent. The Hanoverians detested them. The north of Germany, however, relied on Prussia, whose power remained undiminished. The Count of Schulenburg was governor of King William's new acquisition. He gave me rather a cold reception. Our success at Ulm and Austerlitz appeared to him but indifferent. The latter battle, he affirmed, was indecisive. He said it was like the Battle of Zorndorf, which was fought by Frederick the Great against the Russians, and in which Count Schulenburg had himself been engaged. "What sort of victories would he have?" said the emperor when I told him this anecdote. I went from Hanover to Hamburg, where I found Bourrienne. Here I was well received, and I knew the reason why. I returned to France, and on my way passed through Munster, where I saw General Blücher, whom I had known some years before. I paid him a visit. He was not well disposed towards the French, yet he received me with a great deal of civility. I remained a week with Augereau at Frankfurt, in order to see and hear all I could, for such were my instructions. Napoleon had just made a demand for contributions on that town, and the inhabitants were alarmed lest they should be obliged to pay them. We occupied Darmstadt. The marshal who had established his headquarters in the capital of that principality was neither a favorite with the court nor with the people, and his staff was still less liked. The Grand Duchess sent me an invitation through Augereau, who seemed to be partial to that country. I declined it, not having any instructions to that effect. She commissioned him to transmit to me her complaints. They were very severe. I departed for Wesel. I was to examine the state of feeling in that quarter, which was already occupied by our troops. On my return, I gave Napoleon an account of all that I had seen and heard. I concealed nothing from him. I spoke particularly in behalf of Darmstadt, but he was enraged against the Duchess. She had written a terrible letter to the King of Bavaria, relative to what she termed the ill-assorted union of her niece Augusta with Prince Eugene. Among other insulting expressions, she made use of the words horrible marriage. The emperor, who conceived that the glory of having achieved great deeds was well worth the advantage of having descended from those who probably had no glory to boast of, could not pardon the feudal prejudices of the Duchess. He was on the point of depriving her of her states, but Maximilian interceded for her, and she escaped with the punishment of a 6 months' occupation by our troops. That is to say, her people were obliged to atone for the offense which her vanity had led her to commit. Scarcely a fortnight had elapsed since my return to France. The court was at St. Cloud, and Napoleon was at the theater. In the middle of the performance, he received a dispatch from the Grand Duchy of Berg. He opened it. It contained an account of an attack made on our troops by some Prussian detachments. "I see," said he, "they are determined to try us. Mount your horse and seek the Grand Duke at Neuilly." Murat was already acquainted with the affair. He came immediately. Napoleon conversed with him for an instant and gave me orders next day to take the command of the military division at Strasbourg, to organize battalions and marching squadrons at that place, to direct them in succession upon Mentz, and to send to the latter place a large quantity of artillery. The infantry embarked on the Rhine in order to arrive earlier at the place of their destination. I corresponded directly with Napoleon. I employed couriers, telegraphs, and all the most speedy modes of communication. I could not venture to put 100 men in motion to change the place of a gun or to move a musket without informing him. I had been 2 months engaged in these preparations when he arrived at Mentz, whence he wrote to me to join him at Würzburg. He sent me a letter for the Grand Duke of Baden and directed me to deliver it to the prince myself. The object of this letter was to request him to send his grandson, the present Grand Duke, to the army. I found the venerable old man in his ancient castle of Baden. He seemed at first much affected by the contents of the letter, but he soon made up his mind to send the young prince, and he ordered preparations for his departure. He did me the honor to recommend his grandson to me in a very affectionate manner. The prince set out on his journey 2 days afterwards and joined us at Würzburg. The King of Württemberg was already there. He had just determined on his daughter's marriage with Jerome. Napoleon was in particularly good humor. The alliance pleased him. He was no less satisfied with the Grand Duke, for Murat had singularly prepossessed him in favor of that prince. In a letter which Murat addressed to the emperor some days before, he said, "I waited on the Grand Duke of Würzburg, whom the letter and the news which I communicated to him, that the treaty admitting him into the Confederation had been signed at Paris, have relieved from the greatest anxiety, for he very much dreaded not being received into the Confederation. He seemed particularly affected by the sentiments of goodwill on the part of your Majesty, which I expressed to him. He evinces the greatest readiness to contribute everything in his power to the service of the army. Today, his admission into the Confederation of the Rhine was proclaimed. Every preparation has been made for receiving your majesty at the castle, where nothing seems to be neglected, which may render your stay here convenient and agreeable. We had yet received no positive information with regard to the Prussians. We knew not whether they were on the road to Magdeburg, in Saxony, or at Gotha, or even what was the amount of their force. We had, however, a sufficient number in the field. Gentlemen are not more scarce on the other side of the Rhine than elsewhere, but the reports were so contradictory that it was impossible to form any distinct idea on the subject. At one time, it was said that the enemy's advance guard was at Hof, that Coburg and Memmingen were occupied, that the Prussians avoided partial actions and wished to try their fortune in a pitched battle. At another time, it was affirmed that Hohenlohe was advancing on Schleiz, that Ruckel had formed his junction, that the Queen had gone to Erfurt, and that the headquarters were removed from Hof to Nauenburg. This arrangement did not correspond with the nature of the places. It seemed inconceivable. We were as uncertain with respect to the extent of the enemy's forces as we were concerning their line of operations. Amidst all these various accounts, we learnt that Kronach was occupied. The Grand Duke sent to inform us that that citadel was under repair and would soon be in a state of defense. Napoleon was astonished that the Prussians had not made themselves masters of it. "What could have prevented them," said he, "since they absolutely wanted war? Was it the difficulty of the attempt? The place was destitute both of provisions and artillery. They had sufficient courage for the enterprise. Did they not consider the place of sufficient importance to try to secure it? That fort commands 3 great outlets, but these gentlemen care little about positions. They are reserving themselves for grand strokes. We will give them what they want." Napoleon every moment received accounts of the Prussian army. Ruchel, Blücher, and the Duke of Brunswick were impatient to commence the war, and Prince Louis was even more so. He urged and hastened hostilities and feared to let the opportunity escape. He was, besides, a man of great courage and talent. All accounts agreed on this point. Napoleon, who did not dislike this petulant eagerness, was conversing with us one evening respecting the generals of the enemy's army. Someone present happened to mention Prince Louis. "As for him," said he, "I foretell that he will be killed this campaign." Who could have thought that the prediction would so soon have been fulfilled? Prussia at length explained herself. She required us to abandon our conquests and threatened us with her displeasure if we refused to evacuate Germany and recross the Rhine. The demand was modest and worthy of those who urged it. Napoleon could not finish reading the document. He threw it away contemptuously. "Does he think himself in Champagne?" said he. "Does he want to give us a new edition of his manifesto? What, does he pretend to mark out a route for our march back? Really, I pity Prussia, I feel for William. He is not aware what rhapsodies he is made to write. This is too ridiculous. Berthier, they wish to give us a rendezvous of honor for the 8th. A beauteous queen will be a witness to the combat. Come, let us march on and show our courtesy. We will not halt till we enter Saxony." Then turning immediately to his secretary, he hastily dictated the following proclamation. "Soldiers, the order for your return to France was issued. You were already within a few days' march of your homes. Triumphal fates awaited you, and the preparations for your reception had commenced in the capital. But while we thus too confidently resigned ourselves to security, new plots were hatching under the mask of friendship and alliance. Cries of war have been raised at Berlin, and for 2 months we have been provoked with a degree of audacity which calls for vengeance. The same faction, the same headlong spirit, which, under favor of our internal dissensions, led the Prussians 14 years ago to the plains of Champagne, still prevail in their councils. If they no longer wish to burn and destroy Paris, they now boast their intention to plant their colors in the capital of our allies. They would oblige Saxony, by a disgraceful transaction, to renounce her independence, by ranking her in the list of their provinces. They seek, in fine, to tear your laurels from your brows. They expect us to evacuate Germany at the sight of their army. What madness! Let them learn that it would be 1,000 times easier to destroy the great capital than to sully the honor of the children of the great people and their allies. In their former attempt, the plans of our enemies were frustrated. They found in the plains of Champagne only shame, defeat, and death. But the lessons of experience are forgotten, and there are men in whom the feelings of hatred and jealousy never become extinct. Soldiers, there is not one of you who would wish to return to France by any other path than that of honor. We ought not to return except by passing beneath triumphal arches. What? Have we braved the inclemency of the seasons, the ocean, and the desert? Have we subdued Europe often united against us? Have we extended our glory from east to west, only to return now, like deserters, after having abandoned our allies, and to be told that the French eagle has fled in dismay before the Prussians? But they have already arrived at our advanced posts. Let us, then, march upon them, since forbearance will not check their infatuation. Let the Prussian army experience the fate which it shared 14 years ago. Let us teach them that if it is easy to obtain an increase of territory and power with the friendship of the great people, their enmity, which can only be provoked by the neglect of prudence and reason, is more terrible than the storms of the ocean. Our soldiers only wished to fight. The Prussians occupied Saalfeld and Schleiz. We charged them, routed them, and made 1,000 prisoners. These were the two first engagements which we had with them. I quitted Murat, whom I had been ordered to follow, and went to render an account of the affair of Schleiz to Napoleon, who had established his headquarters some leagues in the rear, at the residence of a princess of Reuss-Lobenstein. On my arrival, I found Napoleon engaged with Berthier. I informed him of the success of the Grand Duke and of the defeat of Tauentzien. "Tauentzien!" exclaimed Napoleon, "one of the Prussian intriguers. It was well worth our while to urge on the war to such a length." He told me I might retire and take some rest, as I should be roused in a few hours to set out on a mission. I had no idea whither I was to go. I was called about 5 o'clock. The Emperor gave me a letter for King William, who at that time, I believe, held his headquarters at Sondershausen. "You must go," said he, "as fast as you can after the King of Prussia, and deliver to him this letter from me. I ask him once more for peace, though hostilities have already commenced. You must endeavor to convince the king of the danger of his situation and the fatal consequences which may result from it. You will return immediately and bring me his answer. I shall now march on Gera." Our baggage was still in the rear. I had no carriage, but I procured one from the coach-house of the Princess of Reuss-Lobenstein, put 4 good horses to it, and started about 6 o'clock. Before I had proceeded a league on my journey, Napoleon sent after me. I returned and went to his study, where he had been occupied the whole of the night. He desired me to deliver the letter to Berthier. "Upon reflection," said he, "I will not have one of my aides-de-camp charged with such a message. You are persons of too great importance to be exposed to the chance of meeting with a bad reception." The letter was sent 2 days after by Monsieur de Montesquieu. He started, I believe, from Gera. The treatment he experienced is well known. He was stopped by the Prince de Hohenlohe, at that time general-in-chief of the Prussian army, who obliged him to be present at the Battle of Jena, and did not send the letter, as it is affirmed, until after the action. Several persons in Napoleon's suite were of opinion that if I had executed the commission with which I was at first charged, I should have come up with the King of Prussia, and the war perhaps would not have taken place. I do not think so. The gauntlet was thrown. There was no alternative but to take it up. I do not even think that Napoleon was more inclined for peace than King William.
Chapter 11.
We were now in possession of the whole course of the Saale, and in a fair way to turn the enemy's army. The calculations of the Duke of Brunswick were completely frustrated. He had formed the idea of coming up with us on the Mainz, of occupying our wings by detached corps, and penetrating our center before we could concentrate our forces. He still possessed all the threads of that vast spy system which had harassed France since the emigrations. He knew the force and the route marked out for several corps which were marching from Meudon, and he did not doubt of anticipating us. Napoleon took a pleasure in cherishing this illusion. He made preparations, and caused reconnaissances to be taken through the whole of that line. The Duke had no longer any doubt of having penetrated our intentions. We were to debouch by Königshaften. He made certain of that. He felt perfectly convinced of it. Our movements on his center were only a snare, a ruse de guerre. We wished to deceive him in order to prevent him from debouching by the forests of Thuringen, whilst we proceeded towards Coburg and Memmingen, in woody and mountainous countries, where his cavalry would have no opportunity of acting, or at least would be deprived of its advantage. It was of the utmost importance to anticipate us, and he hurried to Königshaften. The enemy were engaged in the woods. Napoleon marched on Schleiz, 60 leagues from the presumed point of attack. The Third Corps quietly reposed on the 10th at Nauenburg, in the rear of the Duke of Brunswick. Hostilities were of only 2 days' date, and that prince, who was already uncovered on his left, was on the eve of being entirely cut to pieces. His communications with the Elbe were in danger, and he was nearly reduced to the same extremities as Mack, whom he had so violently censured. His advance guard, on arriving on the Mainz, found the field unoccupied. This circumstance seemed incomprehensible, but still it never led him to suspect the danger to which he was exposed. The rout of Saalfeld alone shook the confidence which he had placed in his own safety. He hastily retraced his course. Weimar and Hohenlohe were directed to come up speedily, and the army of reserve was ordered to make a forced march. But some parties mistook their route, and others did not use sufficient dispatch, so that a portion of the troops were not engaged in the battle. The Duke, who was disconcerted at a system of movements so novel to him, knew not what determination to adopt. All these marches and arrangements, so rapidly succeeding each other, formed a mass of confusion in which he could discern neither plan nor object. The occupation of Nauenburg relieved him from this perplexity. He saw his left wing about to be turned, or at least exposed. He would not wait longer. He hastily rallied his army of reserve, which was advancing upon Halle, and left Hohenlohe at the camp of Kapellendorf to mask the retrograde movement. His troops, who had not shared the disasters of Saalfeld and Schleiz, ridiculed the beaten corps. They shouted, "The king forever! The queen forever!" etc. They resolved to avenge the affront offered to the Prussian arms. There were not enough Frenchmen for them. The Duke himself had resumed his confidence. On the Auerstadt road be found not more than 30 chasseurs. His communications were free. It was impossible they could be intercepted. It was not easy to surprise a skillful maneuverer like the Duke. Hohenlohe's Prussians were encamped behind the heights of Jena. Their masses extended as far as the eye could reach. They were prolonged beyond Weimar. Napoleon reconnoitered them on the evening of the 13th and fixed the attack for the following day. In the night, he distributed orders for the movements of the different corps. As to Davoust, he must march on Apolda so as to fall on the rear of the enemy's army. He may take whatever route he may deem most expedient. I leave that to himself, provided he take part in the battle. If Bernadotte be at hand, he may support him. Berthier, issue instructions accordingly. It was 10 o'clock at night. All the arrangements were made, and yet the general commanding the enemy's force flattered himself with the hope that we could not debouch. But the axe of the pioneers removed every obstacle. The rock was cut, and trenches were opened. The action commenced on the right and the left. The conflict was terrible. Davoust, in particular, was placed in a situation in which a man of less firmness might have found his courage fail him. Bernadotte refused to support him. He even forbade 2 divisions of the reserve cavalry, which, however, were not under his command, from taking part in the action. He paraded round Apolda, while 26,000 French troops were engaged with 70,000 picked men, commanded by the Duke of Brunswick and the King of Prussia. But this circumstance only added to the glory of the commander, whom it might have ruined. Davoust's plans were so well laid, his generals and his troops deployed with such skill and courage, that Blücher, with his 12,000 cavalry, had not the satisfaction to cut a single company. The king, the guards, and the whole army attacked our troops without obtaining better success. Amidst the deluge of fire that surrounded them on all sides, the French preserved all their national gaiety. A soldier, whom his comrades had nicknamed the Emperor, impatient at the obstinacy of the Prussians, exclaimed, "On with me, grenadiers!" "Come, follow the emperor." He rushed into the thickest of the battle, the troop followed him, and the Prussian guards were penetrated. He was made a corporal. His friends remarked that he only wanted the protectorate. At Jena, the victory had been no less brilliant. The rout was complete and general. The enemy fled in the utmost confusion. In the evening, I was directed, together with the Grand Duke, to pursue the wrecks of the Prussian army. We took some Saxon battalions, and we entered pell-mell with them into Weimar. We stationed our posts before the town, dispatched some parties of cavalry on Erfurt Road, and presented ourselves at the castle. Monsieur de Pappenheim, whom I recollected having seen in Paris, came out to meet us. He was quite alarmed, but we assured him he had no cause for apprehension. All the court, with the exception of the Grand Duke and his family, were at Weimar. The Duchess received us with perfect politeness. I was acquainted with several ladies of her suite, one of whom has since become my sister-in-law. I endeavored to calm their fears. They took courage. Some few disorders took place, but they were of little importance. Murat took up his quarters at the castle. I set out to join Napoleon at Jena in order to render him an account of the events of the evening. He did not think that they would go beyond Weimar. He was highly satisfied. The courage of the Duchess astonished him. He did not imagine that the court would have waited for him. He did not like the family. This he often repeated. The night was far advanced, and Napoleon had just received dispatches from the Second Corps. "Davoust," said he to me, "has had a terrible engagement. He had King William and the Duke of Brunswick opposed to him. The Prussians fought desperately. They suffered dreadful slaughter. The Duke has been dangerously wounded, and the whole army seems to be in terrible disorder. Bernadotte did not behave well. He would have been pleased had Davoust been defeated, but the affair reflects the highest honor on the conqueror, and the more so as Bernadotte rendered his situation a difficult one. That Gascon will never do better." The battle was lost. The Russians were no longer eager to carry on the war. They wished for and invoked peace. They were anxious to terminate a contest in which they had had such ill success. By dint of wishing for an armistice, they at length persuaded themselves that one had been granted. Kalkreuth announced it. Blücher swore that it was concluded. How could it be discredited? Soult, however, was not to be caught in the snare. The imprudent generosity evinced at Austerlitz had rendered him distrustful. He refused to afford a passage to the troops whom he had cut off. "The convention you speak of is impossible," said he to the field marshal. "Lay down your arms. I must receive the emperor's orders. You shall retire if he permit it." Kalkreuth was unwilling to resort to this kind of expedient. It always has somewhat the appearance of a defeat, and he would rather have experienced one in good earnest. Some other columns were more fortunate, but it was only deferring the evil moment. They were obliged to surrender some leagues further on. It was not worth while to resort to the deception. The king himself was disheartened by his misfortunes. Our hussars gave him neither truce nor respite. He recollected all that Napoleon had done to avoid hostilities, and he addressed a letter to him. It was rather late to reply to overtures which had been so ill received. "It would have been better," said Napoleon, "had he explained himself 2 days sooner. But no matter, I am willing to accede to anything that is compatible with the dignity and interests of France. I will send Duroc to the King of Prussia, but there is something still more urgent yet. Duroc, set out immediately. Proceed to Nauenburg, to Dessau, wherever we have wounded troops. See that they want for nothing. Visit them for me, each man individually. Give them all the consolation their situation requires. Tell the marshal, that he, his generals, and his troops have acquired everlasting claims on my gratitude." He was not satisfied with this message. He wrote to assure him how much he was pleased with his conduct. His letter was inserted in the order of the day. The troops were transported with it. Even the wounded men could not refrain from expressing their delight. The emperor established his headquarters at Weimar. He showed every possible mark of respect to the Duchess, whom he found to be an amiable and sensible woman, and of very dignified manners. Meanwhile, the enemy was rallying on Magdeburg. The wrecks of the army that had been engaged at Jena, the army of reserve, and the troops of Old and New Prussia hastily repaired to that place. The Duke of Württemberg had already taken a position at Halle, and Bernadotte proceeded thither. His corps had not been engaged at Auerstadt, and he was eager for an opportunity to compensate the portion of glory he had lost. He attacked the Prussians with the bayonet, killing and routing all that opposed him. The carnage was dreadful. On the following day, Napoleon visited the field of battle. He was struck with the sight of the heaps of dead which surrounded the bodies of some of our soldiers. He approached, and observing on their uniform the numbers of the 32nd, "So many of that regiment," said he, "have been killed in Italy, in Egypt, and elsewhere, that I should think none can now remain." He proceeded to Dessau, and showed every consideration to the old Duke, who was there with his son. Some months before, a Monsieur de Gousseau, who was attached to the court of Baden, had said to me in Paris, "You will probably go to war with the Prussians. Should that be the case, and should you advance in this campaign as far as Dessau, I charge you to respect its venerable sovereign, who is the father of his subjects." Monsieur de Gousseau must have been very much astonished to find that the French, instead of going only to Dessau, advanced as far as the Niemen and subsequently to 20 leagues beyond Moscow.
Chapter 12.
The Prussians fled at full speed, but the more rapidly they retreated, the more eagerly we maintained the pursuit. Being overtaken within sight of Magdeburg, they took refuge behind the entrenchments, where they were soon forced to lay down their arms. The garrison was invested, and William, who was there, thought himself happy in escaping. All around him had crouched beneath the storm. Prussia was no longer the valiant nation which entertained the idea of driving us back upon the Rhine. A reverse of fortune had overthrown her. A single blow had leveled her with the dust. She flew to meet defeat. She yielded and delivered herself up. Never was a nation laid so low. Her fall was about to be completed. All our corps were preparing to march on Berlin and to take possession of the city. Napoleon, however, reserved that honor for the corps which had most contributed to the victory, namely, that commanded by Davoust. The following are the instructions which he addressed to the Marshal. Order to Marshal Davoust. Wittenberg, October 23, 1806. If the parties of light troops, which you have of course dispatched on the roads leading to Dresden and the Spree, inform you that you have no enemies on your flanks, you will direct your march so as to be able to make your entry into Berlin on the 25th of the present month at noon. You will cause the General of Brigade, Hullen, to be acknowledged as commander of the garrison of Berlin. You may leave whatever regiment you think fit to do duty in the city. You will dispatch parties of light cavalry on the roads to Kustrin, Langsberg, and Frankfurt on the Oder. You will station your army corps at the distance of a league or a league and a half from Berlin, the right supported on the Spree and the left on the road to Langsberg. Fix your headquarters on the road to Kustrin at some country residence in the rear of your force. It is the Emperor's intention to afford his troops a few days' repose, and therefore you will construct for them huts of straw and wood. Generals, staff officers, colonels, and others must be lodged in the villages in the rear of their divisions, and no one in Berlin. The artillery must be stationed in positions which cover the camp, the artillery horses at the piquets, and all in the best military order. You will cut, that is to say, intercept, as early as possible, the navigation of the Spree by a strong party, so as to stop all the boats that may attempt to proceed from Berlin to the Oder. Tomorrow our headquarters will be at Potsdam. Send one of your aides-de-camp to inform me where you may be on the nights of the 23rd and 24th. If Prince Ferdinand should be in Berlin, present your compliments to him and give him a guard with entire freedom from quartering. Publish immediately the order for disarming the troops in Berlin, leaving only 600 militia for the police duty of the city. The arms of the citizens must be conveyed to some place that may be determined on, to be at the disposal of our army. Make known to your corps that the Emperor, in directing it to be the first to enter Berlin, gives a proof of his satisfaction of the excellent conduct of the troops at the Battle of Jena. Be careful to direct that all the baggage, and particularly that which is in bad condition, shall halt at the distance of 2 leagues from Berlin and rejoin the camp, without passing through the capital, but by proceeding along another road on the right. Finally, make your entrance into Berlin in the best possible order, and by divisions, each division having its artillery, and marching at the interval of an hour after each other. The camp being formed, give orders that the troops proceed to the city only by thirds, so that there may be always 2/3 at the camp. As His Majesty expects to make his entrance into Berlin, you may provisionally receive the keys of the city, informing the magistrates that they must nevertheless deliver them up to the Emperor on his arrival. You must require the magistrates and persons of distinction to receive you at the gates of the city, in all due form, and direct your officers to make the best appearance that circumstances will permit. The Emperor proposes that you shall make your entrance by the high road of Dresden. The Emperor will probably take up his abode in the palace of Charlottenburg. Give orders that everything may be prepared for his reception. There is a little rivulet which falls into the Spree, at the distance of 1.5 leagues or 2 leagues from Berlin, and which intersects the road leading to Inn.
This concludes today's reading of the Memoirs of General Rapp, presented by Major Antonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapters, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at Intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.